At this point, we now have a character, we're a little more familiar with the rules, so now we should finally be ready to begin playing our first game of Dungeons & Dragons. But before you do actually start playing, this episode is a reminder that this is a game played with other people. This human interaction is what makes D&D a different experience from playing a video game or reading a book. In this last episode, we're going to be talking about the Dungeon Master's role in the game, setting up table rules, as well as some small tips to help you become a better player. Typically in a D&D game, there are between 4 to 6 players, and as you will now know, one of these players will take on the role of being the Dungeon Master. The DM has many jobs to fill: lead storyteller, writer of the adventure, and referee of the rules, to name a few. The DM will also be the one who plays the part of any monsters and NPCs that the players come across, both in terms of mechanics and roleplay. More often than not, they have the most prep work out of all the players. The game couldn't happen without their efforts, so be sure to appreciate your DM. The Dungeon Master is another one of the players after all, and they also want to have fun. Don't think of the game as the DM versus the players. D&D is a collective storytelling experience, and between all the players, including the DM, the goal is to create a memorable story of the player characters in a world that the Dungeon Master has set. The Dungeon Master is also likely to be the one organizing the players, determining the dates that they can get together to play. On top of that, you'll need to figure out where you can meet up to play. Though online games are becoming more commonplace, especially with the current state of the world. For any new DMs out there, I'll continue to be making videos on different topics in the future. So if there's something you want to hear discussed, please leave a comment in the video and I'll try to hit interested topics. So maybe you have or haven't found a group to play with yet. Let's say, for the sake of a hypothetical situation, you have found a group to play with. One of the players has agreed to be the Dungeon Master, your character sheet is ready, people have brought snacks, and you're ready to roll some dice. Now that everyone's ready to play, it's an important first step to establish some table rules as a group. D&D is meant to be a fun experience, but it can also be an experience very much outside the comfort zones of some players. As a group, you should set up a tone of respect, applying rules that will assist any sensitivities and help foster trust amongst everyone at the table, as well as trying to limit distractions. Examples of some table rules might include not touching other people's materials, whether that be books, dice, or character sheets, unless you've been given permission. Leave any personal conflicts outside of the game. Some DMs may prefer you not to have electronics at the table, or if you have your phone, to put it on silent or vibrate. I personally don't mind electronics at my game table as long as they're being used for character sheet apps or dice roller apps. Try and see what rules work for your group, as every group is going to be different. It's also important to discuss any topics that might make the players uncomfortable, so that the DM can be sure to avoid such things in the story, or at least skip over them if the players are okay with that, such as any violent story content or scenes of horror. You might also want to establish expectations about table talk and dice rolling. Some example rules for table talk: the players should establish if they're speaking in or out of character. Are the players able to backtrack on any decisions their character makes? Or are players able to share information if their character is unable to speak? Some groups are particular about how the table rolls dice. Some example rules about dice rolling include: players should roll their dice in the middle of the table where everyone can see. The Dungeon Master should determine if they're going to use a DM screen. Establish what happens if a die falls off the table or is cocked and leaning against something. There will also be the inevitable moment where the game stops to address a question about the game rules. Though you can't go through all the rules together before a session, the group can decide how to manage these questions when they do happen. Whether everyone is okay to stop the game to discuss the rule, have the DM make a quick temporary ruling and look up the correct rule later, or the DM makes a temporary ruling and assigns one player to look up the correct rule while the DM continues to run the game. Everyone should agree on the protocol to deal with game rule questions when they come up. This will save a little bit of time when they do. Lastly, and though this can be uncomfortable, your group should decide on how to deal with any social conflicts between players that might happen at the table. I want to put it out there that I'm not a professional counselor or mental health expert, so I'm not trained in dealing with these kinds of situations. But just as you do, I interact with people, and social conflicts can arise regardless of whether we're trained for it or not. Sometimes all we can do is try our best and fix these situations when they happen. So I'm going to offer some insight based on some past experiences I've had. If a situation arises between players during a session, the DM might put a pin in it and wait to address it at the end of the gaming session as a group, unless it's immediately derailing. Or players who have an issue can approach the DM after a session to discuss it. If it involves another player, you can schedule time to talk with the players involved, or before the next session if they're fine with that. Unfortunately for the DM, they kind of fall into a leadership role here as well, and might have to be the mediator of these conflicts because they are the ones in charge of the game. Sometimes the solution to a conflict in a player group might mean that someone can no longer play in that group, and the DM might have to be the one to tell them. Or if the idea is presented to the players in conflict, one of them might volunteer to bow out. Trying to find ways to solve these issues isn't easy. It's important that every player try to be considerate and respectful to their fellow players, to make sure that everyone can have a good time. Once all the players are in agreement to the rules of the group, it's finally time to dive into the adventure. This next section is going to be some quick tips for DMs and players to consider. Some will help the DM with sessions, and some will help players in playing their characters. For the first tip, even though we've already made a character in this series, I'd recommend a group run a Session 0. A Session 0 is a first-time meeting for the group, where they can talk about their character ideas, what they want to play, and what kind of adventure the DM is going to run. This would also be a suitable time to have the discussion about table rules and etiquette. Afterwards, everyone can build their characters together. This next tip has something to do with character builds. Many players want to play the lone wolf, a character who is independent and prefers to do things their own way. You can play a character like that, that's absolutely fine, but you have to consider why that character decided to join up with an adventuring group. Because, once again, D&D is a cooperative game. You need to collaborate. And if your character wants to be alone, that's not going to work in a D&D group. So ask why your character's there. Do they think being part of a group can be profitable? Are they looking for extra protection because someone is out to get them? Figuring out why they want to be part of a group can make a character who prefers to be alone work in the context of a team-based game. In a similar vein, this next tip is find ways to say yes. Figuring out how to say yes is a struggle for some new players as they get used to learning how to roleplay. For example, the party might be trying to interrogate a monster, but you've decided that your character hates monsters and you think your character would just slay the creature. However, this is not the goal of the party, and acting against everyone else at the table can create conflict between players, especially if this sort of thing happens over and over. Perhaps you could say yes to the situation by describing your character looking really angry during the entire interrogation, and waiting until the group gives you a signal for you to destroy the monster. This would help your character remain true to their motive while also not making the other players mad at you. This can be especially true if it results in the death of another player's character. I think one of the most common ways that a group conflict can happen is if a player's character dies because of another player's choice. If someone has the chance to save another character and doesn't do anything about it, even if the characters don't like each other, find a way to say yes. This could be a route for the characters to begin liking each other, and will definitely prevent hard feelings between the actual players. Another big one for players, do your character homework. Fill in your character sheet, know your spells, know your character. If a player shows up and hasn't attempted to understand their character's abilities and spells, it can be a bit insulting to the DM who's been busy creating an entire adventure for your single character. Sometimes it does happen where a player just doesn't understand something about their abilities or spells. That's fine, you can ask your DM about it or other players. What matters is that you put in the attempt to understand how your character works. The last tip I'm going to give is about possibility paralysis. D&D is a game where someone can tell you can literally do anything. And that can be overwhelming for new players. If you find that you're at a loss of what you can do in the game, ask your Dungeon Master for some options. And for DMs, when a player asks you this question, don't just say whatever you want or anything you can think of. If it's during combat, give them some action options such as dodging, dashing, or hiding, which can be found in the books. In any pillar of adventure, whether it's exploration, social interaction, or combat, remind the player of what's in their immediate environment. If there are things that stand out and can be interacted with, or if there doesn't seem to be anything, tell them that they can attempt to search the area. So, DMs, provide your players with actual options to help limit possibility paralysis when it comes up. Your players will eventually become familiar with what they can do, so you will be helping them get used to the game. These are just a few tips, and if other situations arise that you might want insight into, leave that in the comments too. I'll try to help. If you happen to notice you're in one of these situations, you now have an idea of what might help you. But there isn't a quick fix for every issue. So as a group plays together, their characters will experience growth in the form of leveling up, better equipment, and treasure. But sometimes the end of a character's story might mean their demise. So D&D isn't a game that's won or lost, it's just a story. And stories can have happy or unfortunate endings. We touched on it briefly not too long ago in this video, but I want to talk a bit more about the possibility of character death. Sometimes a character can drop to 0 hit points, and when they begin rolling their death saving throws, their party might not be able to get to them in time to save them. And then sometimes it can be the fault of the dice, having some unfortunate d20 rolls while you're making your death saves. If a character does die, it's natural to be sad at their loss, which is an amazing thing about this game, the fact that we get attached to these fictional characters. However, death in D&D isn't always a permanent thing. There might be ways to bring a character back from the other side, though this might be a quest in itself. In the meantime, though, you should make a new character and learn from the previous character, and invest yourself in a new story. And if someone else runs a game, perhaps you can bring back that old character you had lost. Just because they died in one game doesn't mean you can't use them in someone else's game. To keep your character alive, you'll need to think smart, tactfully, and with a mindset of working with your team, the other players. In the end, D&D is about having fun with other people and creating stories and memories that everyone in the group will remember for a long time. But we haven't even started playing yet. We shouldn't be worrying about the end. You have yet to experience the beginning. To help you get started, I'm going to suggest some resources to help you play D&D. And my videos aren't sponsored by anybody, so I'm not affiliated with the resources I'm about to pitch to you. These resources are mostly good for playing D&D games online. Because of COVID-19, many people who play D&D can no longer meet up like they used to. And so we've adapted, and these are the resources that a lot of people are using. On the website D&D Beyond, you can create your character on a digital character sheet. This eliminates the need for pencil and paper at the very least. If you so desire, you can also purchase a digital copy of the player's handbook there as well. With this resource, it will guide you through the character creation process and will go much more quickly than working with pencil and paper. However, you can only customize your character with the character building options from whichever digital D&D books you've bought, or the minimum options from the basic rules guide. The next resource I want to mention is Roll20. This is a website with tools that allow players to simulate a virtual tabletop. Players can video chat over the site, they can roll dice and write messages in the chat box, and a crafty DM can assemble maps and digital miniatures for their players. It's a nice substitute for being at the same table, and the groups I've been playing with have been using these resources to play our games, and it has become crucial in how we play D&D while being socially distant. So where can you find games to join? Normally, if we were able to go out and socialize, you could find hobby, comic, and other types of gaming stores that usually organize a D&D night that players can pop in and out of. These types of events would require players to build their own characters beforehand, and they could join in on sessions that kind of feel like an episode of a TV show. The adventures that these types of places run are designed to allow new players to come and go. But since that isn't an option in the current world we're living in, there are Discord servers for D&D games where you can ask to join an online game. If you don't know what Discord is, Discord is computer software that allows people within the same channels to communicate through text, video, and pictures, and has been another resource that my D&D groups have been relying on in these strange times. If you go to Google and type in D&D Discord servers for new players, you can find groups that might be a good fit for you. One such server I found was called Tabletop Penguins, a server that is looking for new players and DMs of all ages and experiences. I personally don't know this group, but it seems like a good place to start. I mean, who doesn't like penguins? If you'd rather play with people that you already know, it's time for you to reach out to some friends and see who might be interested in playing. However, because you have made it to the end of this series, it might mean that you are the most qualified person to become the Dungeon Master. If you're able to get some people together, but aren't quite ready to step into the role of the Dungeon Master just yet, talk with your group and see if there is anyone who will bravely step into the shoes of the DM. If someone volunteers to be the DM and they haven't played before, perhaps you can recommend this series to them. It will teach them the rules of the game, and they can be better prepared to become a Dungeon Master. Otherwise, with everything that we've covered in this series, you should be able to help any players who need help building their characters and understanding the rules of the game. Hopefully, this series of videos has helped you feel more prepared to join a game of D&D. And if there were any experienced players that sat through the series, hopefully I was able to clarify any rules you were wondering about. As you begin to play D&D, you might realize that the D&D setting isn't particularly interesting to you, or you're not as interested in the fantasy genre. If that ends up being the case, that's okay. There are many different types of tabletop role-playing games out there for many different types of interests. If you're into sci-fi, I would recommend looking into Shadowrun or the Star Wars tabletop role-playing game. Or if you're looking for more of an eldritch horror kind of game, there's Call of Cthulhu. But the point being, there are hundreds of games out there, and I'm sure one of them will be right up your alley. If there are any topics anybody wants me to go into further detail about, leave a comment in any of these videos, and I'll continue helping if I can. I hope to offer some help for DMs in the future, so keep an eye out for those videos as well. I'm also going to have other players and DMs join me on this channel, and we will all chat about rules, our experiences and characters, and what D&D means to us. But for now, it's about time you go on an adventure. So have fun, be kind, and play dicely.